All right, well, we are now live. Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. Looks like our slides have advanced while I was away from the computer here. So here we go. We'll get back to our starting point. Sorry a bit for the spoiler there. I hope I didn't ruin it for anyone. So here we go. We'll turn my camera on and we'll get going. All right. Yeah, left it on this slide and come back to another slide. Guess the ghosts are touching my computer or something. All right, so welcome to our live stream, our chat with the archaeologist, brought to you, of course, by the Mesa Prieta Petroglyph Project, which is, I think our logo's right there. Yep. This month, we are celebrating 6 months of live streams with yours truly. So thank you all for tuning in. I hope I've been bringing you some really informative perspectives and at least some good springboards on how to jump into the archaeological literature, trying to tone down the academies and bring these topics to a more general audience. But we're not trying to tone down the topics themselves. We really are trying to touch on some hard-hitting topics. So yeah, this month we'll be talking about shamanism. But before we dive into that, I want to give you all a reminder and ask that you tune in to our Mesa Talk series this month. On Tuesday, September 29th at 6 p.m., Tim Wilcox, who is Tewa and Dene, will be talking about the Gubernador polychrome pottery. So please tune in for that. Mesa Talks, of course, is a series brought to you by, of course, the Mesa Prieta Petroglyph Project and Los Luceros State Historic Site. We hope you all can make it, and if you can't, you can always tune in to the replay. Now, that you will find on our social media on Facebook, both on the Mesa Prieta Facebook page as well as the Los Luceros State Historic Site page. And if you have any trouble, usually some of us are online to help get you into the stream. All right, so let's get into shamanism here. We're just going to cover a few basic points of this and try to really get to the core of the discussion. This is a topic that's been discussed a lot in anthropological and archaeological literature, and it would be really easy to go down a lot of rabbit holes here, but I'm really trying to boil this down to, the real meat of the debate. So to that end, we're going to keep this strictly to 5 basic points. That's going to be, what is shamanism? How do you pronounce it? We'll get to that in a moment. Where do we find it? What are the critiques of the use of the word shamanism, of the category, and is the term still helpful? Then, of course, there's going to be a wrap-up with my usual list of references, which you can also find in the description below. And we'll take some time for Q&A. So that's another reason why I'm keeping this week's talk a little bit shorter and a little bit more narrowly focused than some of the ones leading up to this one. If you think about the archaeoastronomy talk was a little bit long, and so was the one on non-binary gender that I did in, I think, July. So again, we're going to try to keep this short because I imagine there are going to be some questions in the stream. So, and I do see quite a lot of you tuning in. So hello, thank you all. Thank you all for tuning in, and can't wait to get to your comments at the end here. So do put those comments in the live chat. I think there on your screen, probably. Yeah, I'll get to those at the end. So first off, before we even do what is shamanism, how do you pronounce it? Well, the proper British pronunciation would be shamanism, and the practitioner of shamanism would be the shaman. Now, in American English, there is another accepted pronunciation, shaman. So a shaman would be a practitioner of shamanism. Both the American and English conventions are technically acceptable pronunciations. So one could say either shamanism or shamanism, shaman or shaman. However, in academic circles, you tend to run into the British pronunciation a little bit more than you run into the American pronunciation. You may hear me switching back and forth. I did learn it the American way first and then picked up the British way. So old habits might percolate up through. But yes, technically, shamanism and shamanism are both accepted pronunciations. That aside, what is it? Well, it's a generic term for a specific variety of animistic religions that doesn't encapsulate all animistic religions. There is a paper by Winkelmann written in 2010. You'll find that one in the description, that goes into several points that sort of help narrow down the focus on the category of what is shamanism and, as compared to other religious traditions and other practices. But really we can focus on just a couple of points and not go through Winkelmann's entire list here. So first off, it is a religious practice that treats both physical and mental ailments as spiritual problems that require spiritual interventions. It utilizes, for our second point, it uses what we call altered states of consciousness, often trance, but not limited to trance, also states of ecstasy, to contact the spirit world. During these practices, the practitioner will develop social relationships with what we call other than human entities within the spirit world. Other than human simply means not human. And these can include a long list, which we get to on the next slide here. And finally, supernatural power is either gained or expressed through song. Now, because we're talking about a cross-cultural category, we may find the bulk of these, but one or two of the points might be missing. So we're really looking at the overarching trends here, even if there is some variability in the way that it's expressed. And next slide. So, broadly, there are two ways in which shamanism might be practiced. There are shamanic practices, where the person engaging in these sorts of rites, this person who uses altered states of consciousness to contact the spirit world and enact healing of physical or mental ailments, or to express some sort of prowess in another part of life from the spiritual energy gained in this practice. If that person is a ritual specialist who's trained in this, we call that a shamanic practice. This is in contrast to the idea of shamanistic practices, which is a more catch-all category, or shamanistic practices, if you will. This is a more catch-all category for any situation in which someone participates in these practices, regardless of if they are a trained specialist in the topic or not. Shamanic and shamanistic practices are not necessarily mutually exclusive. For example, something that we often see in the Americas, and especially in the traditions that I work with, is we'll see an institution of ritual specialists, often referred to as doctors in most translations, but we'll also see other individuals engage in these rites at specific points in their life, especially when they're coming of age into adulthood, when they're undergoing some sort of crisis in life, say if they're having trouble provisioning for food, if oh, that's my pets. I don't know if you can hear them in the background. Hello, Haku. Okay, he's fine. Haku's my cat. My dog is also in here to So I think they're just laying down together. It's really cute. The cord on the camera won't reach, or I'll show you. Okay, so where I left off was that you'll have the ritual specialist, the doctor, who is practiced in these rites and might do them more frequently, but generally every member of that particular given cultural group might engage in some of these practices when they're coming of age, or when they are going through a life crisis, whether that is an ailment, whether that's a crisis of faith because some disaster has happened. Imagine if you're going through a situation where you lose your whole family, or if you're having trouble provisioning, especially in hunter-gatherer groups. If a man, typically male activity, we've talked about gender in archaeology, and it's not always clear-cut, but say a guy is having trouble hunting and can no longer provision for his family, well, that is a life crisis. And so that might be a time that they engage in these activities to try to sort out what's going on, to try to seek guidance from the supernatural realm on how to move forward. So that's an example, and we find examples like this among many North American groups, where you have shamanic ritual specialists within an overarching religious system that is also shamanistic, right? So we have the ritual specialists, but we also have other members of that society participating in these types of practices, entering altered states of consciousness, contacting the spirit realm, enacting healing through prayer song and spiritual intervention at specific life stages as well. Those might be guided experiences, and that's an entirely different rabbit hole. All right, so when we're talking about other than humans, I said we would get to it on this slide. Other than humans, or in common parlance, spirits, can include things like deities, ancestors, helper spirits, and place spirits. So if we think about world religions, then we can start to parse out not necessarily religions with, say, not necessarily all religions with ancestor veneration, but those in which ancestors are thought to directly intervene in the world of the living might be showing some type of, at least, shamanistic expression. What we often see in the Americas is the acquisition of helper spirits. We often hear these called spirit guides. This term is not necessarily favored in academic circles, but as far as a popular term to understand the concept, certainly spirit guides is something that you might have already heard of. So helper spirits, these are personal spirits, not necessarily ancestors, and not necessarily deities. Deities being beings known about in oral tradition, communicated among a much broader audience, fairly universally known within a given tradition, right? And then we also have place spirits, or the technical Latin term would be genii loci. So place spirits are entities that inhabit a particular place. So just to turn this concept completely on its head, if we think about the spiritualism movements in the Western world, particularly in the United States and Great Britain, and I think spilling a little bit into the rest of Western Europe, but especially in the United States and Great Britain in the late 19th and throughout the 20th centuries, that some of the practices involved, if you include mediums going into trances, the idea that a place might be haunted by a place spirit, right? So these are concepts. Speaking broadly, these are religious concepts that can be considered shamanistic. And in fact, the medium might be seen as a shamanic practitioner. So even though we're trying to address here indigenous religious movements and indigenous religious traditions, it is kind of important to recognize that this term can be applied to Western society and Western culture as a part of the process of demystifying that, the importance of which comes up, well, in a few slides. All right, so where do we find it? Well, everywhere. If I'm to hide my head here for a moment, and you can see the poor choice in color scheme with my arrows, but they point to basically everywhere in the world. We've got North America, we've got Alaska, which would have been part of Beringia, we've got Siberia and northeastern China, we've got an arrow pointing at Finland, not seen on this perspective of the globe. We've got sub-Saharan Africa, especially southernmost parts of Africa, like Namibia, Botswana, South Africa, and Lesotho. But yeah, North and South Americas. There's been a lot of research on shamanism in the Great Basin. However, most Native American traditions are widely believed to express a lot of these traits. The term was coined in East Asia in studies of native Siberians, and it was probably first imported by anthropologists into an area that is not East Asia in studies of the Sami, which are an indigenous group in Finland. Interestingly, the Sami language is not even it's not even an Indo-European language. They've been around there for a long time. So anyhow, yeah. So the term was coined for Siberians in East Asia. Typo. Oh, terrible typo. It's supposed to say China. I'm sorry about that, folks. I must have had double vision when I was typing that out. Anyhow, northeast China, native Siberians, and the term was used to apply to the Sami. And then anthropologists noticed that a lot of these practices were included in sub-Saharan Africa. And so we see in studies of especially the Sangkung, I'm not going to do the clicks because I'm going to do it wrong. Just know that I'm mispronouncing it because I don't have the phonemes in my language. So the Sangkung in sub-Saharan Africa have been widely studied for their shamanistic practices. Similarly, the Great Basin has been intensively studied for this in the Americas, but the term has also been applied to Mesoamerica, to the Great Plains, and to other parts of the Americas. So it's really widespread and thus presumed to be one of the earliest and most widespread religions in antiquity. The categories for which are under debate and outside of the purview of this talk, but yeah, this is most likely one of the earliest religious traditions. It is expressed differently in all of these different places, and not all of them express the same traits. So if we are to look at, say, the Great Basin, so this is the Koso style of petroglyphs, often called the Koso style of petroglyphs, and it's largely associated with what we call the gypsum complex, or sometimes the Newberry period, in the northern Mojave Desert, which is the southern Great Basin. Some of the things you might notice about this is that these figures, they don't really have human faces, any of them. But they do have certain interesting markings. These are often called pattern body anthropomorphs. by scholars, and that's because, of course, there are intricate patterns on their bodies. Some of the cues that you might notice are this sort of wild hairdo or headdress, the not quite central figure, but the front most prominent and brightest figure on this has a headdress of quail top knots. So that's some religious symbolism, but you'll notice the concentric circles or bullseye head. So that's rather interesting. Oh, all right. I'm gonna make some adjustments to the stream here. We're having some connectivity issues. All right, we should be back here. I'm experiencing some rather poor internet connectivity here, so the stream might glitch or freeze or periodically drop out. So I'm sorry if that interrupts any of my explanations here. I was showing you some pictures of these pattern body anthropomorphs from the Coso range. And what's striking about them is that they're lacking these human faces, and that these concentric circles are believed to be, for heads and faces, are believed to be some kind of supernatural expression, possibly that they have entered into a trance state. That's also a part of the iconography that we see on their bodies, which was most likely painted onto ceremonial shirts. So what we're seeing in the patterns are expressions of entering into an altered state of consciousness, a trance, if you will, that's expressed in the concentric circles of the head, as well as the patterns on the body. These also include some symbolism about contact with spirit helpers, which is also included into the iconography of this panel, and that iconography was probably actually worn on physical shirts worn by ritual specialists. You'll see that these figures are holding some implements. We have some examples similar to this at Mesa Prieta. So if you look at the background image on the slide that we were just looking at, we see some of the same rays around the head that we saw on the previous slide. We also see the concentric circle head, and if we look back at the Coso example, look at their feet. All right, those aren't human feet, right? Those are bird feet. Flip back to Mesa Prieta again, and same thing. We've got bird feet on this figure. In fact, the implements held by the figure from the Coso example are also seen held by similar figures at Mesa Prieta. So, when we're talking about finding signs of shamanism in the Americas, when we start to look for these signs of, sorry, I should explain, the bird feet are a metaphor for entering into a trance. They're a metaphor for magical flight, which is a metaphor for trance. It's one of the most common such metaphors for a, it's one of the most common metaphors for a shamanic trance, right? So this has been greatly studied in the Great Basin, and when we find it at places like Mesa Prieta, that makes us want to say, hey, we're seeing some of these same practices here. But we have to be careful, because there are a lot of criticisms about the category of shamanism. All right. I have listed two more recent articles, one by Klein et al. I don't remember the co-authors on that one off the top of my head, but Klein et al. and Sundstrom are some of the ones in the references section that I've provided that provide some critiques. So one is that shamanism is too general of a term, and that it's used too widely to discuss too many different religious traditions. I was just pointing out these parallels between Coso style, which is roughly 2,000 or more years old in the Great Basin, versus the 500-year-old petroglyphs at, or 500-year-old, 5 or 600-year-old petroglyphs at Mesa Prieta. But we're talking about different cultural traditions. So we don't want to say that the religion in the Great Basin or in the Mojave Desert is the same as among the Pueblos a millennium and a half apart, right? They may share some characteristics, but if we use one term to describe them all, many of the critics say that this is too general, right? One of the other criticisms is that it ignores indigenous ideas of religion, indigenous ideas, ideology, and religious institutions. Again, we can't presume that the religious practices in one area thousands of miles away are the same in another area thousands of years later, right? It's also been used to primitivize non-Western cultural traditions, and as a sort of conjunction to that it is considered a New Age fantasy. And finally, before elaborating on these, that it masks cultural variability. Again, we don't want to say that Pueblo religions are too comparable to religions of non-Puebloan peoples thousands of miles away, thousands of years prior, right? So we do have to recognize that cultural variability, and that often gets masked, especially when we're talking about shamanism as this sort of widespread, earliest religious tradition enduring over great time, right? It makes it sound too much like these all originate from one source, and like they all have virtually no independent histories, and that it is just the one history of the spread of shamanism. Some consider that to have mapped along with the spread of people. So we want to recognize some of that cultural variability. I want to touch on the New Age thing, because another one of the papers, in fact it's actually a book in the references, is by Eliade, which was translated into English in the 1960s. So when that reached an English-speaking audience, we were at the height of the psychedelic counterculture movement. So a lot of people who were experimenting with ways in altering their states of consciousness, that were doing this often in a setting that involved music, in addition to those particular ways of altering their state of consciousness, they started to see parallels in what Eliade was saying versus the past. So Eliade is often portrayed by critics of the category of shamanism as this sort of, here, we can make me bigger now. I'm not crowding out a background image anymore. All right. So Eliade is seen as this sort of, or is portrayed as this culture hero of the New Age movement, bringing shamanism to this modern, really global religious or at least spiritual movement. But really, Eliade was writing about a full decade prior to the onset of that countercultural movement, and it was just happenstance that the timing was that the book was finally translated into English at about the time that the topic became popular. And so one of the fallouts of this has been to implicitly primitivize non-Western cultural traditions, and especially their religious practices. You may often hear people refer to these religious expressions as spiritual practices. And that's not to say that they aren't spiritual practices, but the use of the term spiritual in place of religion, or explicitly avoiding the term religion, when we're talking about anthropological work, implicitly demeans the culture being studied, portraying them as too culturally simple to actually have developed something as complex as religion. That's the implication, and that's what some people walk away with. it also, by being this general broad term, it can primitivize peoples in that way too. That they haven't necessarily developed cultural traditions of their own is the implication. Now, of course, there are responses to this sort of criticism. So, in recent years, the categories have been the category of shamanism has been refined, and not necessarily redefined, but refined to describe a very specific set of religious practices in the social structures that go along with those religious practices. If you're interested in the details, read the Winckelmann article. Again, I'm not going to go into that, but it does a great job of sorting out shamanism from the more overarching category of animism, and also of distinguishing shamanism from more priestly religions. So if we think about the Abrahamic religions plus Zoroastrianism, those are more priestly religions, or as some might call them, bureaucratized religions, in which the pathway to the spirit realm, heaven, God, is mediated by officials within a church. Even, see, I don't want to step on too many hot button topics here. We may see some shamanistic practices in more mainstream religious movements in the United States, but even in those cases, the overarching structure might still be a priestly structure, right? So, again, without going down a rabbit hole and starting a firestorm in the comment section, I just want to say that the idea of shamanism has been sorted out a bit more and specifically defined. In that same article, Winckelmann does a statistical analysis. Again, I figure if I start providing stats on the screen here, then we're going to lose half our viewership. So I'm just going to summarize that as there are clusters, and that these traits that Winckelmann describes as shamanism, if we think back to that earlier slide, I give you some of the most central points: the contacting the spirit realm for healing, the entering into altered states of consciousness. And there is an actual statistical basis for, if multiple of these traits show up, the bulk of these traits show up, right? So there's definitely something going on with these are all interrelated. Also, much of the work in the last 40 years on shamanism has relied heavily on ethnography and consultation. Excuse me a moment. So, all right, we're back. Yeah, much of the work in the last 40 years has relied heavily on ethnography and consultation, despite the fact that many of the critics have claimed that scholars working on the topics of shamanism have ignored the ethnographic record and avoided their obligation towards consultation. Actually, quite to the contrary. The identification and ongoing support of the presence of shamanism in Great Basin religions, for example, is strictly founded on ethnography and direct consultation. Now, again, the indigenous peoples of the Great Basin, say the Paiute and the Shoshone, will tell you that they had doctors, right? They don't necessarily describe these as shamans, but the ethnographic account, and we'll get into the doctors part on the next slide. But so it's important to understand that this is an outside category, what we in anthropology call an Edic category. That means it's outside of the cultural traditions that we study. Right? Archaeologists have, especially in the last 20 years, begun to avoid using the term whenever possible, especially when working in the Southwest and Mesoamerica. So at Mesa Prieta, we'll often use the word ritual specialist, right? Rather than using the word shaman, because the word shaman comes with all this baggage. Baggage that, well, often attributed to New Age. I don't want to turn off any New Agers here. If there are some New Agers in the stream, thank you for tuning in. Wish you luck with all, I mean, like, no, keep doing what you're doing. I hope this is informative, and we're not trying to turn you away. We're not trying to point the finger at you, right? Rather, New Agers have been used as sort of an scapegoat, and they are a popular audience that has, at times, contributed to some of these problems. So just, if you're a New Ager, be aware that the religions in Mesoamerica and the Southwest may have similarities, but they are different religious traditions. And we could go for like a whole week's worth of these videos every day talking about the parallels and, you know, the comparing and contrasting Southwest and Mesoamerica religious practices. But then I'd never do anything else. So yeah, just be aware that there's cultural differences, and that's why we say ritual specialist, because again, there's a sort of institution. These are shamanic rather than shamanistic religions, and again, we'll touch on that a little bit more in the next slide. And then the last point on this slide is when alternatives or indigenous words are known, they are often introduced in the literature alongside shaman. So in my own work in the Great Basin, there are various cognates of this word, puakanti, poage, puagati, or huyagati. Contextually different, but used alongside puagati. These are different versions, whether you're speaking Paiute, Timbisha, or Kawayasu. The point being is that we do try to introduce, or at least those of us with some level of scholarly rigor do try to introduce the indigenous terms alongside, because we're doing two things at once, right? We're studying the specifics of a particular cultural expression, but at the same time, the other thing that we're doing is trying to also produce data that helps us address broader questions. And that's one of the reasons why this is still a useful term, right? If just go back to the responses to the criticism, because I've got one more point on this, is that many of the calls to ditch shamanism entirely and just use the indigenous words, or just think about things in the very specific context, start to atomize our worldview. And so this has some of the same problems as overly primitivizing peoples, in that when we start to get too particularistic and atomize that view of cultures and seeing them as these bounded little islands, then we miss a lot of the processes that go into making those cultures emerge. We miss their impacts on the world and the influences they have. So, is shamanism still useful? Yeah. And when we see shamanistic practices occurring, whether it's in indigenous traditions or whether it's in contemporary Western traditions like spiritualism and the New Age movement, then we're also tracking some of the influence of these other non-Western religious traditions on emerging religious traditions. And just about any New Ager will tell you that, right? That they're getting their inspiration from non-Western religious traditions. So that's a good thing. honestly, learning about cultural traditions that are outside of your own cultural practice, whether you adopt those practices or not, because, again, whole other video on, we can make a whole other video on cultural appropriation. But honestly, learning about other cultures and gaining wisdom from that that's a good thing. So again, I'm not trying to discourage that, and just foster some level of awareness that we don't want to overly primitivize people. Instead, we want to demystify this experience. It was once, many of these things that were ascribed to shamanism had previously been ascribed to mental illness, and in fact, in a part of the critiques of the use of shamanism, especially in the early critiques, say in the 1980s, that many of the ways in which people experience an altered state of consciousness can be related to issues like migraines, to mental illnesses that lead to delusions or hallucinations, to epilepsy. I'm not going to say how other cultures dealt with these, because it was probably negotiated within that culture and even on an individual level, on an individual basis. And that's not to say that that someone who might be prone to epileptic seizures might not also be seen as some kind of sage. If we think about some of the stories from the classical world, I'm sure you can come up with some examples. But that is actually just as damaging of a perspective as attributing these practices to just some primitive widespread religion. Again, those approaches miss the cultural specificities and overlook the fact that these are trained individuals. And that's something that I really want to emphasize here, is that when we're talking specifically about shamanic religions, those ones with that sort of institution of the ritual specialist, even if we look at hunter-gatherer societies, so we're going to go back to the Great Basin again, and we keep going back there because the Great Basin was often portrayed as the most simple and most primitive cultural area, but it really wasn't. It wasn't so simple and devoid of structure or expression or meaning as anthropologists at the time were trying to convey. So the doctors there, the shamanic ritual specialists, they studied for a minimum of 5 years. They developed a specialty. They were, in every sense of the word, a doctor, at least in the sense of the word that we use the word doctor today to award, say, a doctorate of philosophy or a doctorate of any field. In other words, they were just as specialized in their religious practice, in their knowledge of some specific kind of knowledge, whether it's the sourcing of materials for and production of tools, whether it was in hunting practices and strategies, whether it was in keeping the songs, which are very much the living memory of people, especially in societies without writing, whether it was in the practices of healing and herbal medicine. They studied for years. They were as much a doctor as I am with a PhD. And this is among the folks who had previously been considered the most primitive. And that's what I'm trying to get at, is that we shouldn't primitivize these people. These are cultural institutions. So, yeah, we might see some of those practices from there, from the Great Basin, some of the same iconography even, expressed here at Mesa Prieta. Different culture, different language, different history, different stories, different different ecology, different plants around, different medicine, different memories. But we use the term to describe some of the similarities that link these. Now, what is the Tewa word? There's no one Tewa word, at least not that I'm aware of, because people are inhabiting different roles, they have different specialties, and those specialties are studied. So we want to avoid that primitivizing narrative, and so we'll often use the word ritual specialist, but in the literature, I myself will use shaman and shamanism to discuss these broader cross-cultural trends that connect aspects of different societies, right? Because that helps us get to the bigger questions. Some of these big questions are, what is the origin of art? What is the origin of visual culture and visual expression? What is the origin of oral tradition? Why are humans so religious? I'm sure there's atheists tuning into this stream right now, but overall, the trend of human history has been to be religious in some way. Why is that? Is there something about the human nervous system that predisposes us to religious and to religious or magico-religious thought? And how do we make meaning in the world? In a world so full of chaos and surprises, how do we make order and make meaning? And that may be one of the most fundamental questions of the human condition. Shamanism is one of the concepts that allows us to approach this. It's not the only one, but it really does help us address these questions. So when we can use this in a cross-cultural term, I would say, let's go for it. And just to close, again, I don't want to blame the New Agers, because anthropologists have been using the term shamanism for a century now. Are we to just discard that? Are we to discard 40 plus years of use before the psychedelic countercultural movement? No. Let's not ignore the history of our tradition, of our discipline here. We should be working to improve it and acknowledging that our discipline has contributed to the primitivizing of peoples by uncritical use of terms like shamanism. But does that mean that that word is invalid? Well, according to statistics, it's not. According to some of the research directions we want to go with in answering these bigger questions, it's a valid category. So let's just be careful. So, yeah, there we go. Avoid that noble savage trapping. People aren't just engaging in these practices for... they're not just engaging in these practices simply in order to enter that altered state. And especially... It's difficult to talk about shamanism without bringing mind-altering substances. And I have expressly avoided that, because that's not the only way of altering one's state of consciousness. Dance, song, exhaustion, and other means of reaching a state of ecstasy can be used. Mind-altering substances might be administered, but we should also understand that they're not used in the party context of say, Western society use of mind-altering substances. They were used in a religious context, often in almost invariably in a guided setting that, even without the substance, was designed to inspire some of the same adjustments to perception. And so thinking about religious specialists in the past as the forebearers of the psychedelic movement, in that maybe they took mushrooms. Well, they're not the forebearers of the movement. Sorry to burst your bubble. Whether a New Ager and a ritual and say a Maya ritual specialist can both have a religious experience, a moving experience that involves ingesting mushrooms, sure, why not? But that's not the point. That's not the focus. The focus is a religious expression. one that develops a social relationship with other than human entities, that can make interventions in this world. And that not all shamanism is the same. And yeah, so that's, I think, where I want to leave it. Do consider other meanings. What we're seeing in the iconography may look like shamanism, but it might have other meanings in a particular cultural tradition that you're looking into, and that's a part of the critique. So, again, references. Oh, let's pop my head out for a second. So, references are found in the description below. This is just a sample, but this will get anyone who's interested, started at least, and yeah. So I'll take any questions. If you have any questions on the air, I've got the chat open right now. Yeah, I see the comments about the sound problem. My internet is not great on a good day, and today is apparently not a good day for my internet connection, so it did kind of cut in and out throughout the talk. I hope most of it got in there. Does everyone feel that was kind of clear? Do you have any questions? I'm really trying to do this without demeaning anyone's beliefs. I do feel that, as much damage has been done by, people uncritically applying this term, I think that it's actually encouraging to have interest from folks with, say, New Age belief. So we're not trying to demean that. All right, so we've got Paula here as a question. How common is it for shamans to transform themselves into animals? This is my favorite thing. Yeah, animal transformation. It just barely didn't make my list. That's one of the most common things. It's not a universal, but it's pretty common. We have possible examples at Mesa Prieta and elsewhere, especially among flute players that show both human and animal characteristics. If we think about Mesoamerican religions, there would be often a ritual specialist, either some kind of priest or warrior, who would don a regalia that might include a mask. And some of the masks we find are, say, of the rain god. And when they were wearing this, they would embody that spiritual being. So that's an example of shamanic practices with animal transformation, because the rain god has pointy jaguar teeth, and often we'd be wearing a jaguar pelt. So the jaguar, the power of the jaguar as an animal was definitely a part of it. Very common. It's one of my favorite areas of study, and I'm trying to build up a sample to just show some of those. All right, so Amy Crane says this was fantastic, very well balanced, and such a thoughtful approach to the subject. So thank you, Amy. Let's see here, Paula. When I visited Little Petroglyph Canyon in the Cosos, the tour leaders said there was a local traditions that the shamans would transform themselves into bighorn sheep. Yes, bighorn sheep and other animals. So, some of the folks from around there, the last Numic shaman, Bob Rabbit, who lived in the 20th century, did these pictographs. And so if we look at, ignore my sticky note here, we can see some signs of animal transformation in there. There's evidence that, at Coso, all the way up to the early, what some call the proto-historic period, that was still going on. Nancy Sharp asks, what is the Cosos? So the Cosos are a range of volcanic features, mountains and lava fields in eastern California in the northern Mojave Desert on the margins of the Great Basin. It is one of the densest concentrations of petroglyphs in North America, if not the world. I'd say it's, kind of on par with Mesa Prieta. Yes, thank you, Paula. Yeah, and so a lot of the work on shamanism in the Americas has been done in that area, as well as a lot of the debate about shamanism in the Americas has also focused on the COSOs. So worthwhile, definitely worthwhile mentioning. Amy Crane asks, are certain animals more popular or significant than other animals? Does it depend on the region? Yes and yes. Yeah, each region has its own religious symbolism. So if we look at the Great Basin, one of the highest orders of animals was the bighorn sheep. It was associated with the sort of sky world because of the color of its tail and where it's found, and its rutting season happened to coincide with the monsoons in the area. So when thunderstorms would come in, you'd also get thunder from the male competition beating their horns and thunder from the hoofbeats. And so the bighorn sheep was, like Paula noted, might be one of the animals that a shaman might transform themselves, or that a doctor might transform themselves into. Often these aren't necessarily, they may be chosen by the person, but from that person's own sort of inward experience, they often might see their spirit helper, say in the form of an animal, but not always, sometimes in the form of a person, come to them to share their spiritual power. And so someone who transforms into, say, the bighorn sheep probably had a prior experience where they experienced the bighorn sheep come to them while they were in the midst of this shamanic or at least shamanistic trance, and impart spiritual power to them. So when they embody that, they are embodying their spirit helper, and so that bodily transformation is an expression of this sort of shared pool of spiritual power between themselves and their spirit helper. If we're to go to Mesoamerica, kind of similar thing. Jaguar's like the biggest, baddest thing out there, right? Like, you don't want to mess with a jaguar. So if somebody could hunt a jaguar, they've got, they've got some mojo, to borrow a term from Austin Powers. And so being able to don that jaguar pelt was to be able to embody that power of the jaguar, especially not necessarily if someone hunted it, because we should also think about the economics of the exchange, that elites might want these pelts, and they might actually be hunted by middle to lower status individuals who then provided those as trade or tribute to the elites. But yeah, so in Mesoamerica, the jaguar would be the thing to turn into. Yeah, I believe that there's some horned animals in sub-Saharan Africa that were also, I think the true antelope might be one of those things that was more commonly transformed into. Ken says, another great talk. Thanks, M Triple P and Dr. Levosh. Thank you, Ken. So yeah. And Debbie says, really enjoyed the talk. Thanks. Thank you, Mom. Hi, Mom. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We are about out of time here. Thank you, everyone who chimed in with comments and questions. Paula says, thanks, I learned a lot. So, great. And thank you for your questions, Paula. And, you all have a good weekend. Again, remember to tune in to Tim Wilcox's talk on the Gubernador Polychrome. I keep wanting to say the Governor. Sorry, my old Californian coming back in. Yeah, the Gubernador Polychrome Pottery, and that will be on Tuesday, September 29th at 6 p.m. The link will be on our Facebook page as well as that of Los Luceros. Again, have a good weekend. Later.